Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this afternoon's seminar. Absolutely delighted this afternoon to welcome Bertrand Augier from the University. Bertrand is a lecturer in H3 who specializes in the institutional, administrative, economic history of the late Republic, specializing particularly in military matters. He's published journal articles and chapters and edited volumes on figures like Sextus Pompeius and Pompey and the Adriatic fleet. Tonight, Bertrand's title is Crises and Violence at the End of the Republican Period. So thank you very much, Bertrand.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak in this seminar. So thank you very much. And I will share the presentation. Okay. Okay. So the starting point of this work is the word crisis, which originates, as we know, from the medical vocabulary. It is nowadays a key concept in the humanities and social sciences, with a growing use in the media. According to Reinhard Koselleck, in this article I give you reference here, its uses have been incorporated into modern social and political languages, admittedly in a great variety of ways. A crisis could be defined as an event characterized by its abnormality, which cuts through and judges. It brings into play both the past and the future, breaking with the usual modes of action, which implies facing the uncertainty. It brings questions on the social, political, economic, or cultural frameworks which previously went on unquestioned. In short, we could speak of a crisis, according to Jean-Michel David, when a society is unable to reproduce itself, neither maintaining its modes of action, in particular the political ones, nor conforming to its representations. Regarding the late Roman Republic, the modern scholars thought generally assured that the period beginning with the tribunate of Tiberius Gracchus in 133 before Christ and ending with the Battle of Actium in 31 before Christ saw the development of a serious crisis which ended in a paroxysmal way with the civil wars and ultimately the Augustan Principate. This vision derived from that of illustrious contemporaries. Cicero's writings, in particular, show the awareness of a disease of the Respublica, which he seeks to cure. So the translation of this passage is more or less in the state of sickness, in the almost hopeless situation of the Republic, while the judicial actions are corrupted and sullied with the perversity and unworthiness of a few men, the only remedy is that the most honest, the most active take over and defend the laws and establish the authority of judicial actions. So there is a crisis rhetoric in the Ciceronian works, so already in the 1st century before Christ, and it was subsequently picked up and amplified by later writers, such as, for example, Plutarch, so Greek writers. And Plutarch says that the state of affairs absolutely demanded a monarch, a king, and that God had given him to the Roman as the gentlest physician and the most capable of curing their disease. So here, Plutarch uses a metaphor of a disease to describe the political situation in the last decades of the Republican period. and he presents personal power as a way to cure this disease. We will find the same idea in Appian, another Greek author, which wrote a book named Civil Wars. He emphasizes another characteristic of this late Republican period, that is to say, violence. He says this is how civil strife progressed. He says, aistases, disputes on quarrels, we went to murders, on murders to full-scale war. The word stasis is here crucial. The period was characterized by the division, particularly the division of the ruling elite. This pessimistic point of view was developed already in the 1st century before Christ by Sallust, in particular in this passage of the Bellum Jugotinum. And he says that the Senate and the Roman people share the government without patience or violence. Neither glory nor power lit a struggle among the citizens. The fear of the enemy kept the city in duty. But as soon as this fear disappeared from the mind, the evil friends of prosperity, license, and pride appeared in turn. The nobility and the people put at the service of their patience, one is dignity, the other is liberty, and each to shoot at himself, to plunder, to steal, and the Republic, which had hitherto been between the two, was miserably torn apart. This moral dimension seems crucial for Sallust, as we can find in his analysis of the period immediately following Sylla's takeover. What does he say in a text that I didn't put in the presentation? He says in another text, The Conjuration of Catilina, theft and looting became common law. One coveted a house, the other land. The victors knew neither moderation nor peace. They exercised the most shameful violence against citizens. So for Sallust, which was contemporanean to the events, there was therefore a moral crisis in the late Republican Rome, a moral crisis whose immediate effect was political violence. That is to say, a violence developed by actors in the political field with political goals linked to the Republican political system, the elite of the Respublica. The direct consequence of this political violence was the establishment of the personal power. At least, this is the point of view of the ancient writers. This personal power was seen as unavoidable after a long period of civil wars. It was once again the opinion of Sallust, if we accept the authenticity of the letters to Caesar, which is a text. No, it was Sallust, the author, or not. Here is what I think. As all that is born must perish, when the fatal moments of its fall will have come for Rome, the citizens will come to blows among themselves. Then, exhausted and bloodless, they will become the prey of a king or some foreign nation. We will find the same idea in other Latin authors of the late Republican or early Principate era. For example, Horace, which was a direct witness and a victim of the civil wars. To him, who will want to put an end to impious murders, to the rage between citizens, will have to dare to repress license without measure. I didn't put this text, but it is an extract from his third ode, which was written sometime after Axiom, so after the end of the Civil War. So Horace's point of view is obviously oriented by the context of the construction of the Augustan power, on the climate of political, moral, and religious restoration which accompanied it. Nevertheless, this theological vision of history is what we find in contemporanean historiography and in a lot of scientific works which give to us our vision of this late Republican period. This conception can be summed up in the lapidary formula by Jean-Noël Robert in a recent work named L'agonie d'une république, la violence à Rome au temps de César. I can cite it in French. Les guerres civiles ont sonné le glas d'un régime qui faisait la fierté de Rome, mais qui ne pouvait survivre à son extension territoriale, ni surmonter l'évolution des mentalités et la crise morale que celle-ci avait engendrée. So, the rhetoric of crisis implemented by the ancients then exerted a decisive influence on the moderns. So much that the notion of crisis is usually associated with preconceptions on value-based judgments, to the point that this period was associated in historiography with the notions of decline, revolution, Untergang, or fall. The notion of crisis applied at the end of the Republican period is therefore usually associated with preconceptions on value judgments, consequently inducing a distorting effect on the historical interpretation generally proposed for these years. Here, one could find himself at the same point Edgar Morin was in the late 70s, when he called for a recast of what he called crisology. He indeed underlined that the term crisis is too often used to describe a proven reality, and therefore finds itself devoid of utility because of an increasing naturalized and reified use of the notion. What raises questions is not the operative value of the concept, but the excessively loose and indefinite use that is often made of it in historiography. The crisis is indeed not a simple conflict, it is a complex phenomenon, endowed with multiple concomitant aspects, leading to changes unlikely to lead to overall transformations of a system. Starting from a basic definition of the crisis, it can be characterized by three crucial elements. First, the magnitude and plurality of the structural changes impacting society. Second, limited duration. And thirdly, contemporaneous awareness of experiencing major changes that are generally felt to be negative. The extent and complexity of the structural changes that have taken place is unquestionable, as was the contemporaries' awareness of experiencing major changes, as we saw earlier. The second key element would perhaps be even more decisive in our perspective. That is to say, the chronologically circumscribed nature of a crisis. This dimension seems decisive, as it is paradoxically remains often left aside by moderns in their evaluation of the period. In my opinion, it is indeed irrelevant to consider the last decades of the Republican period as a long crisis, embodied by various conflicting episodes that would be only its different avatars. This perspective reduces these conflicting episodes to simple epiphenomena, warning signs of the ineluctable end of the Republican regime. It would be more interesting to study individually each crisis or critical episode, and therefore to conceive the period as marked by a series of circumscribed crises of varying intensity, such as the Gracchian or Silan episodes, the Catiline War, or the Tribunate of Claudius. The interest of this microhistorical approach is to understand the multiple dimensions and the evolutions of Roman political culture, as well as the elements of continuity. This pushes to its peak the perspective recently initiated by Harriet Flower on Roman Republican history, who cut in various successive incarnations the Republican history, various historical incarnations of the res publica. On the other hand, this perspective is a radical criticizing of the old thesis of Christian Mayer, according to which the last decades of the Republican period did not follow what we can consider as the normal path of a crisis, and can be considered as a crisis without any alternative. So to sum up this point, a reassessment of the importance of short time seems necessary to me to face the critical conjunctures on the more or less significant fluctuations that they could induce. The weight of the event in the sense of external perturbation introduced randomly into a system in the face of structural evolution can thus constitute a path for reflection on critical conjunctures. This reversal of perspective allows us to avoid the theological obstacle we were talking about earlier, trying to revive in certain way the ambition of Eric Goren's work on the last generation of the Roman Republic. This major reversal of perspective then implies also a paradigmatic shift. Crisis must not simply be conceived as a symptom of an overall disintegration of the civic community, but also, and more fundamentally, as episodes necessary for its balance or rebalancing. This perspective on Republican political history opens up a renewed conception of crisis in relation to the contributions of pragmatic sociology, in particular, the works of Luc Boltanski, Eve Chapelleau, and Laurent Thévenot, developed from the late 90s. But also, we can base this reflection on the economics of convention, which has been the subject of recent applications in the modern political history field with the works of Jean-Pierre de Dieu. You have here his recent book about the transition between, let's say, the end of the Bourbon monarchy in Spain. By adapting to the specificities of my period, the conceptual apparatus developed by these two schools of thought, it seems possible to consider the crisis as disputes. The resolution of these disputes presupposed an agreement between the actors around a convention, that is, a rule of coordination known by all and sufficiently rooted for its implementation to be subconscious. These conventions were at the basis of the construction of an agreement within the civic community. By the definition, but the definition of these conventions could change with the political experiences of the time. Through a study of the late Republican critical episode, I should highlight the perpetual reconfiguration of these conventions, making civic unity a permanent creation. This ties with what I said earlier about the fact that contemporaries were aware that large-scale transformations were at work within the city, with the eruption of violence. In their view, this led to the risk for the institutions to go astray, particularly under the pressure from rival imperatores. The main risk was, however, the calling into question of the mos maiorum, of the traditional political order, considered as a direct consequence of the political transformation of the city. One of the major changes in this context occurs with the Gracchi. so the tribunate of the plebe of Tiberius Gracchus in 133 and of Caius Gracchus in 123 until 21, both ending killed. For Cicero, the Gracchi began to undermine the foundations of the Republic, while, according to Florus, later writer, all seditions are caused by tribunician power. In reality, what I would rather distinguish here is the trace of what we can call, sorry, I didn't put it, an internal dispute in the city, recently brought to light by Claudia Moatti around a convention, the definition to be given to the notion of res publica. Claudia Moatti precisely showed that the period beginning with the Gracchian era was characterized by the confrontation between two competing conceptions of the res publica. The first and most ancient one is that of a res publica divided into partes, in which the res publica can't be considered as a theoretical notion, but would rather be the result of interactions, negotiations, and conflicts between the different partes, magistrates, populace, senate, but also the plebs and the patriciate, for instance. On the other hand, from the 2nd century before Christ, there was a strong desire from a part of the Roman elite to clarify the meaning to be given to the term res publica. This strong desire can be linked to the Polybian model of analysis of the Roman institutions, as Claudia Moatti showed. This new conception insists on the fact that the res publica would be an indivisible entity. It insists on the importance of consensus. It is clearly opposed to the previous one. This organic and harmonious conception of the res publica was based on the balance of its parts, on the harmony between the citizens from which the tradition, mos, and the political solidarities arose. Consequently, it supposed the refusal to negotiate around the nature of the res, which was considered as defined once and for all. So I think it best to read the last decades of the Republican period as fundamentally animated by this controversy between these two perspectives, a dispute that moreover partially covers the well-known and much discussed division between populares and optimates. In the first conception, we can see that the traditional political life of deliberative and forensic debate, what we call in French la politique, is completed by the social political mechanisms of the entire Roman city. That is to say, in French, le politique. And this is the conception of le politique, which is quite important here, which is underlined by Vincent Azoulay in an article that I cite here. Le politique désigne un champ d'action diffus et non institutionnalisé, recouvrant l'ensemble des discours, des rituels et des pratiques collectives qui contribuent à forger au sein de la communauté un sentiment d'appartenance partagée. Procession, sacrifice, fête, banquet, distribution, chœur ou représentation théâtrale. Encore faut-il immédiatement préciser que ce n'est que dans un cadre conflictuel, so a conflictual framework, que ces pratiques communautaires peuvent être revêtues d'une véritable force intégratrice. Le politique, corresponding to the extra-constitutional field of politics, was not only, and even essentially, the ritualization of an harmonious civic order, even in many respects ironic, but included a fundamental conflictual dimension, of which one can even to consider that it was somehow connatural within. Crisis would be, in our view, precisely this moment when conflictuality becomes the dominant and fundamental dimension of politics, provoking recompositions on the scale of the city. On violence, to go back to our initial subject in this talk, could be fully part of it. The collective violence movements are particularly well known at the end of the Republican period. The study of this collective violence was recently updated by the publication of the book of Cyril Courrier, La plèbe de Rome et sa culture. In particular, it clearly shows, Courrier shows that the movement of the plebs were almost exclusively registered within the existing political structure, in the official channel of the Roman Republic. Thus, the collective actions of the plebs almost systematically take as a framework three fundamental civic organs: the trials, the comitia, and the contiones, all located on the forum, so the political heart of the city. The violence was often the act of organized gangs, and the objective was to break the normal legislative, electoral, judicial process, since the people was only gathered to ratify or to decide on a bill, to decide on a candidacy, to attend a trial, and to be explained a bill. So there are not many opportunities to express themselves, so they used violence for it. Collective mobilization was carried out in this context for a specific purpose, almost always reactively, and under the impetus of a leader, who was almost systematically a magistrate. It was a question of showing one's approval or disapproval of the acts of or words of an aristocrat or the Senate, through a range of reactions ranging from voting to the most violent physical attacks, but following a largely ritualized coming under social convention. We see this ritualized violence appear again in the decade preceding the civil conflict during moments of crisis, in particular during the consulate of Caesar in 59 before Christ. Thus, according to Plutarch, we have this passage of Plutarch, by virtue of his authority as consul, Caesar applied the proposals that the most arrogant tribunes made to please the crowd, and thus shamefully and basely circumvented the people. Cato's opposition frightened Caesar and Pompey, who resorted to violence. First, when Bibulus, so it is Caesar's colleague to the consulate, came down to the forum, a basket of filth was thrown over him. Then his lictors were attacked and their beams broken. Finally, as the javelins began to rain down and there were many wounded, everyone fled to the forum running. Cato retired at last, slowly cursing his fellow citizens. It's not beams, it was fasces. Okay. We can identify several characteristics, features of ritualized violence. The symbols of power are attacked. In this case, the magistrate in charge, that is to say, the consul Bibulus, is insulted, what the Roman called flagellatio. He was physically threatened. Garbage is thrown at him. This is aimed at undermining the dignitas of the consul Bibulus, whose fasces, that is to say, the symbol of his imperium, are broken. It was obviously a question of dismissing the magistrates symbolically. We are dealing here with a ritual violence which obeyed what Cyril Courrier defines as a code of interpretation, which precisely and traditionally allowed the plebs of Rome to make themselves heard by the ruling class while inserting it into a traditional framework depending on norms of behavior. Moreover, going further, we can affirm that this type of violence was constitutive of a plebeian collective memory. The works of Maurice Alvax, and more recently Pierre Nora, and Jan and Aleida Assmann, have shown that the collective identity of a group passes through the construction of a common knowledge and imagination, otherwise said, of a collective memory. It is memory that consecrates the group's identity and self-awareness, linking yesterday to today, allowing an individual to confuse his personal past with that of a group, connect with the members of a community, and to say we. Certain episodes of violent mobilizations could thus be reactivated to fund these violent actions, such as the memory of the secession of the plebs on the Aventine, or even that of the Gracchian episode, frequently summoned in the speeches of the tribunes of the plebs of popularist tendency in the late Republican period. This ritualized violence, which was part of Le Politique, as defined by Vincent Azoulay, and was fully part also of the first and ancient Republican Convention, however, became intolerable for the largest part of the Roman elite at the end of the Republican period, since this Republican elite was mostly converted to the second consensual and reified conception of the Respublica. The attitude of Cato of Utica, mentioned above, which was cursing his fellow citizens for threatening Bibulus, is revealing. Even more enlightening is Cicero's remark in the De Legibus. Let violence be outlawed. Nothing is more contrary to law and order, nothing less civil and more inhuman than the behavior of one who engages in violence in an established society. So, populares and optimates, to give a basic way of presenting it, were engaged in these disputes over the very nature of Respublica. In this controversy, violence and conflict had a central part. In 46 before Christ, in the midst of the civil wars, in the De Partionibus Oratoriae, Cicero summarized the terms of this opposition, speaking about the trial, famous trial, of the tribune Norbanus. Norbanus was engaged in a trial probably in 94 before Christ. Who was Norbanus? He was an homo novus, popularis, and he victoriously charged Quintus Servilius Caepio, the consul of 106 before Christ, on the grounds that he could be held responsible for the Roman defeat of Orange in front of the Cimbri or Teutons, so German people, in 105 before Christ. This judicial success, and important for Norbanus, was not without consequences, since he was in turn accused de vi, that is to say, of violence, by Publius Sulpicius Rufus, who was tribune of the plebs in 88 before Christ. He was accused for using violence to obtain the exile of Caepio. This was an happy ending for Norbanus, since he was defended successfully by Antonius the orator, and he was acquitted. But this low-intensity conflict can also be considered as a critical episode, as it goes far beyond the strictly judicial framework. And above all, all the trial was focused on the issues related to the controversy of the very notion of sovereignty of the Populus Romanus, which is one of the sub-conventions underlying the convention around the nature of the Republic. Inside this convention, an important part was a place to give to popular violence, to popular political violence. Antonius defends a popularist conception by defending the sovereignty of the Populus Romanus, defined as the people of the assemblies, whose power and rights were to be preserved. With this conception of the Populus Romanus, we return to an archaic rhetoric inherited from the conflicts of order. So we go back to this problem of popular memory, of the popularist memory, that of popular rights and power. Elsewhere, Antoine goes further and tries to show that the sedition Norbanus initiated was a legitimate one, according to a conception of politics that made conflicts and, above all, violence orchestrated by the sovereign people a founding element. Antonius found examples in the ancient history of the city. So the speech is known from Cicero, and what says Antonius is that I collected all the kinds of seditions, the excesses, the dangers they entail. I traced the table of all the revolutions of a republic, and I conclude that if all the sedition had been unfortunate, some, however, were legitimate and almost necessary. I put forward that Crises recalled a moment ago, that it had been impossible either to drive out the king or to institute the tribunate or to restrict the consular power by so many plebiscites or to establish the appeal to the people, that safeguards of the Republic, that palladium of liberty, without provoking a lively resistance on the part of the nobles. That is the seditions that had saved Rome. It was not necessary because a popular movement had been able to rise, to make them a crime against Norbanus on the capital crime. I added that if sometime the people had been recognized the right to rise, which I demonstrated by facts, never had there been a more legitimate cause. So the conflict, sometimes violent, is therefore to be considered as part of the history of the Respublica. So where the crisis it experienced it was a source of recomposition. This vision contrasts with the conception of the optimates, of course, that of the Respublica as a legal form defined a priori and reified. Within this last framework, conflicts and divisions and basically any form of crisis appears unbearable. Within the framework of the mixed constitution, as Polybius asserts, everyone is in his place. And I'm citing the 6th book of Polybius. During the 2nd century before Christ, some families thought to control the political game and under the pretext of achieving this concordia potestatum, of which Cicero will speak a lot in his writings, and to find balance and stability, they try to reduce the field of action of people. Hence, another reified conception of the Respublica, which appears in the Rhetoric to Irenaeus, a text from the 80s before Christ of popularist inspiration. In particular, a passage where it is where is describes the trial of Quintus Servilius Caepio Minor, accused this time by Saturninus of having prevented the vote of his lex frumentaria. So did I put it? No. So he says, but he answers him. He diminished the majesty the one who attains the greatness, it is to say, amplitudo of a city by a lessening detrimentum. I did not do that, but I prevented the diminution, the damage, so the detrimentum, because I preserved the treasury, aerarium. I resisted the passion of bad citizens. I did not tolerate the diminution of majesty. Here, the context is that of another critical episode, the tribunate of the plebs of Saturninus, which ended by a senatus consultum ultimum of 100 before Christ and its physical elimination. The majesty, that is to say, the majestas of the populus Romanus, is defined here by the opponents of the populares as the majesty of the sovereign state, or the res publica as an unbreakable entity, as demonstrated once again by Claudia Moatti. While the populares defended the political rights of the populus, their opponents then accused them of threatening the integrity of the res publica. Indeed, in his defense, as we saw, Servilius Caepio thus evokes the detrimentum, in the very material sense of diminution, of erosion, with a reference to public goods, and in particular to the aerarium, to the treasure of the city. In Caepio's arguments, the central argument is, of course, not the political populace of the assemblies, but the legal people on the res publica, its integrity. The same argument is found against Norbanus in 94, in the trial we spoke about earlier. He was charged for sedition pro re publica by Sulpicius. So violence, even ritualized violence, was thus fundamentally transgressive within this system of thought, in which, according to Plutarch, the aim of political action was to always make concord and mutual friendship reign among its fellow citizens, to make disappear quarrels, discords, and all sorts of enmity. The consequence of this dominance on new convention around res publica is also an alteration of collective memory, with an underestimation of previous conflicts, as a consequence precisely of the rejections of this alteronomic previous conception of the res publica. This transformation of collective memory explains why Appian, among others, distinguishes a break in Roman history, something which is before and something which is after the Gracchian episode. It is in the very beginning of the book about civil wars. He says that among the Romans, the people on the Senate had frequent altercations on the subject of the making of law, the abolition of debts. So he speaks about archaic republic, division of lands and the elections of magistrates. But these altercations did not degenerate into civil war. We did not come to blows. There were only a simple disagreements, contentions authorized by the laws, in which care was taken to preserve the regard and the respect which one owed to another, etc., etc. Say then, no sword was ever worn in political assemblies, no murder was ever committed. So Tiberius Gracchus was the first to perish in a sedition while he was tribune of the plebs and while proposing laws. With him, was massacred in the very heart of the capital, several of those who were locked up there. After these tragic events, the seditions had no end. The spirit of discord was also exalted on both sides. Daggers were frequently armed, and so there were few assemblies, either in the temple, in the Champ de Mars, in Campus Martius, in the Forum, which were not blooded by the murder of the tribunes, the praetors, the consuls, the candidates, etc., etc. So we have an impression of really something changing in the Roman political history. Even if violence existed before, it is, however, certain that the Gracchian episode, and in particular the tribunate of Tiberius Gracchus, marks indeed a turning point, opening up new manifestations of violence. This violence, at this moment, appears no more ritualized, but transgressive and exacerbated. On the other hand, in Appian's text and other texts, there is a minimization of the violence of the pre-Gracchian era. We also note that in the now dominant conception of the Res Publica as indivisible, violence was always placed under the regime of the exception. It was tolerable on condition that it was implemented by a depositary of public authority, rei publicae causa. That is to say, in fact, for a just cause. This is how the figure of the exception emerges in Roman law, which will later be theorized by Ulpian, who defined an act of extreme violence, he says in the digest Vix Atrox, as an action done contrary to good morals. Excepting from this category of Vix Atrox, that to which a magistrate has recourse for a just cause, recte, says in Latin, provided that he has acted according to the law and according to the legal powers of his office. We find this idea applied in the repression of seditious people or in the elimination of adversaries during civil wars. An intolerance to conflict and crisis, violent or not, as part of the evolution in the city, is the dominant feature of the late Republican period. Paradoxically, this led to violent institutional responses placed under the sign of exception. This dimension appears already during Tiberius Gracchus's assassination, as Claudia Moatti evidenced, but most evidently after the vote of a Senatus Consultum Ultimum against Caius Gracchus and his supporters, and their subsequent murder. This procedure shifts the treatment of seditious disturbances, or at least what was perceived as such by the optimatus, from religious or judicial procedure, according to previously existing mechanisms against the crime of treason, of perduelio, to the scope of political decision-making. Thus, a few years later, the consul Opimius, responsible for the execution of Caius Gracchus in 121 before Christ, was indicted. His defenders, Scipio Aemilianus and Carbo, pleaded, according to Cicero, that he acted for the salvation of the patria, pro salute patriae, and therefore recte, according to the category Ulpian gives. This was heavily contested by the supporters of the Gracchi, for whom it was not legal, non iure, to kill a citizen without trial. We see that Opimius's defense was not about legality, but about the legitimacy of the action. Recte, a word we can read in Cicero's text, refers to the conformity with a rule, regula, which is not lawful. This is the recognition of the just cause. In this case, the salvation of this reified republic, which had to be defended against every form of dissent. The exception to the law is based on the principle superior to strict law. So no position between legality against legitimacy. So this led to the acquittal of Opimius. Something then changes with the Gracchi. It is not the fact that violence erupted inside the political system in Rome, since it existed before. It is the fact that ritualized conflict, sedition, or violence were, as I said, intolerable to a growing part of the Roman elite, leading to exceptional procedures and exceptional violence to answer it. What changes with the repression against the Gracchi, indeed, according to Claudia Moatti, and I put the citation, c'est qu'au nom de la res publica peuvent disparaître toutes les sauvegardes érigées contre l'arbitraire des magistrats et pour la protection d'un citoyen romain. La res publica est l'objet même de l'exception et se réduit à son noyau, sénat et magistrat. Thus, in the first century before Christ, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum became the most common response by the Senate to a situation that is considered a state crime, which now was not a crime against the community, but a crime against the institutions, the contestation of the institutions. From them on, the Senate made recurring use of the term contra rem publicam to describe any resistance to its authority as a self-proclaimed defender of the res publica. It used for laws against violence. It was used for laws against violence, Dewi. Law Dewi was proposed by Quintus Lutatius Catulus Capitolinus and adopted in 77 before Christ. And what says the text of this law? It was ordering to investigate without distinctions of days a case of rebels and conspirators guilty of having besieged the Senate, outraged the magistrates, attacked the Republic. The charge of acting contra rem publicam we can see clearly this accusation in this text, can be equated with a threat from the Senate on the eventually seditious citizens, which paved the way for tougher sanctions, such as a statement as Hostis Publicus, was well studied by Agnelli. We can speak here of an obligatory consensus, to use Chantal Mouffe expressions. Any form of dissent seems to be excluded, with the impossibility of entering into a conflicting framework or resolving the political conflict through judicial proceedings. A theory of sedition was therefore set up. What appears in particular through the Ciceronian texts is that dissentio, the disagreement between two aristocrats or two factions, could degenerate into seditio, which appeared precisely when the plebs was mobilized in political conflict, so contra rem publicam in the dominant rhetoric of the time. It occurred in the successive Ciceronian accusations against Catiline, Claudius, and Antony, which therefore openly called for exceptional measures against them. Catiline and Antony were in fact declared hostes, and Cicero wished the same for Claudius, but Claudius was finally assassinated. Any political role was therefore denied to the plebs in a logic of increased control from the elite. Faced with any supposed sedition, military procedures, coercion, summary judgments were put in place rather than traditional judicial procedures, opening the way to negotiation. Here, there is a radicalization with a violent treatment of the seditious who now appear as enemies. In the text of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, we often find this idea mentioned above, that of detrimentum, with its opposite, the notion of salus, of safeguard. This opens the way to radical means of settling political conflicts, such as the Silanian proscriptions of 82 before Christ. This introduced civic degradation, infamy for political reasons, in the name of safeguarding the Respublica. This also opens the way to a hunt for political adversaries by legal means, which will be reactivated by the triumvirs in 43 before Christ. The assimilation of the political adversary to an enemy was complete, opening the way for transgressive violence. Citizenship was no longer a protection. And the period opened up the possibility of violent treatment of political adversaries. The turning point was represented by the years 80 before Christ. Sallust noted that in this part of the Catiline conspiracy, when Sylla had conquered power by arms, then theft and pillage became the common law. One coveted a house, the other land, the victors knew neither moderation, etc., etc. The examples of violence are numerous. Let us evoke the proscription of Sylla, during which, according to Cicero, the outcast is not only banished from the world of the living, he is even, if possible, relegated lower than the dead. Moreover, Lucan, for instance, in the Pharsalia, evokes, among other things, the torture of proscribed aristocrats, such as Gratidianus, which was put to death in a most violent way with many tortures by Catiline. There would indeed be a brutalization of Roman political life, highlighted by a recent article of Clément Bure to be published, following the intensification, probably following the intensification of war violence between the 2nd or 1st century before Christ, as highlighted recently by Nathalie Baron. So there were a shrinkage of public affairs and a negation of the conflictual dimension of politics by a substantial fringe of the Roman elites. The appearance of extreme violence occurs when the city finds itself devoid of any space for conflict, intended to serve as an outlet for crisis situations. Violence is therefore, in a certain way, at the origin of crisis, and not the reverse. So there is here, from a point of view, a shift of perspective to adopt. Violence was a traditional way to evacuate, was a new way, in its extreme form, it was a new way to evacuate every form of contestation. Extreme violence, and therefore ultimately civil wars, became gradually the only possible response in this context to the conflict. The extreme violence at the end of the civil wars is therefore very largely the consequence of a radicalization of the ideology of the defense of Respublica as a reified entity, and of its institutionalization as opposed to a ritualized violence, which was part traditionally of the Roman Commonwealth. The latter has not completely disappeared, in my opinion, we should read, for example, Claudius's political actions in the years 50 before Christ in this sense. And the Ciceronian disqualifications of his motivations in the light of the disqualification of any form of civic dissensus. However, the inefficiency of these episodes of ritualized violence was patent, paving the way to outrageous forms of popular violence. Since this channel of communication, traditional channel of communication, was then blocked. One thinks in particular of the clashes that occurred in 52 and then again in 44 at the time of the funerals of Claudius and Caesar, two leaders populares, who precisely defended an older vision of the Respublica. This new violence also includes clear ritual aspects, as Cyril Courrier has shown. But it was a maximalist way to express this ritualized violence, for example, with the burning of the Curia. It was an outraged form of this political violence that existed from long before. It must be linked to the radicalization of Roman political life. It was only during the civil conflict, therefore an extreme form of crisis, that it had a real influence, allowing the sidelining of the liberators on the preeminence of Antony. But it was a failure in the long term. In fact, in 44, when this attitude from the plebs leads to the preeminence of Antony, it was above all because it was supported by Caesar's veterans. So a group having precisely what can be described as a violence capital, which the plebe was deprived on, or the plebe had not enough of this violence capital. So the political and violent emergence of this new force, the veterans, will shape a new regime, that of the Augustan Principate. But I think this is a story for another time, because I already spoke 1 hour, I think. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much indeed, Bertrand, for this very rich and really fascinating paper. We have a tradition in Newcastle that we take a 5-minute break now to refill our glasses and stretch our legs and look away from the screen for a few minutes. So let's do this now. Maybe
fine.
make it. Sorry?
I say fine. Thank you.
Okay, very good, very good. Maybe we should make this 4 minutes to leave enough time for discussion. But let's take a quick mini break and then come back refreshed to discuss this fascinating paper. So see you in 4 minutes time then.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And Bertrand too has very much deserved a short break. Right, let's give colleagues another minute to come back for the discussion. All right, so it's probably time to get started with the discussion then. I'm sure that there are very many questions and comments. Who wants to begin? Yeah, Emilio, you've been looking really keen from the start, so I was kind of expecting that. Yes, please.
Surprise, surprise. Hi, Bertrand. It's nice to see you.
Hi,
Thank
Emilio.
you very much for this.
Nice to see you again.
So this was a very fascinating paper. I will have to limit myself to just one of the many considerations that I have there, and I will take the move. We'll start from la politique. So what do we get inside the limit of politics? What is the political? So you mentioned Chantal Mouffe's work, and obviously this is a big reference on the back of my mind now for what is political and the limits of the unpolitical. And is connected, my question, if you want, is connected to also to Courier's book and to Courier's perspective on all these, which obviously is a massive influence. So I guess I have 2 points which are kind of connected. One is the ritualization pushes towards a totally political interpretation of this space, which in converse means a rather strict space for material needs and what and the concerns and anxieties related to material needs for the plebs and the lower classes in general. These, in turn, again, gives us an idea of a rather organized form of violence. You mentioned gangs once, I think, rather organized form of violence and very little space for spontaneous action, if you want. So I would ask you what you think about these spontaneous collective actions, whether there were any spontaneous collective actions, whether we have to assume that the leader was always central or not, which has been one of the great debates in the subfield. And the other thing related to this that I would like to ask is how much the interpretation of our sources, which come from specific social milieux, affects our reading of the ritualization of these clashes, riots, and whatever else took place in the late Republic. I'll stop here and maybe say something else later. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilio. So I will begin with a difference between la politique, le politique. So la politique, it will be everything which is quite institutional. So inside the way, let's say, institutions work classically, so with assembly, senate, etc. And le politique will be more every form of political expression, of manipulation, of practice, which is outside this general frame of institutions. That is to say, it can be, so of course, violent manifestation, but also religious manifestations, etc. For your more specific questions, alors, I concentrated my speech on what I consider as political violence. So I excluded all the demonstrations of violence who was specifically linked to the problems of subsistence, for example. For now, let's say that I don't neglect it, but I consider it as something quite different for the moment. But it will change because I'm working on the subject of violence since a couple of months, so it's just something quite new. For the organized forms of violence, I think that, as Augier said, that the plebe has political conscience. That is to say, it is very possible that the plebe was able to have his movements of his own. It was not necessarily guided by an aristocrat. Even if in most of the cases of the ritualized violence, we can see behind the initiative of a Roman politician. In the cases of a ritualized violence, that is to say, a violence against a magistrate, for example, what was the case for Bibulus, which is quite specific. And the fact that our sources influence our point of view, of course, I totally agree for this. So, of course, this is something that we can insist on more than I did. Of course, we are, for example, confronted to this overwhelming presence of Cicero in the late Roman Republic. And of course, Cicero has a very particular way to see the Republican Commonwealth and to describe the political game of his time. So, of course, we are influenced by this. And unfortunately, we have very few texts which can give us the opposite point of view. Even Sallust is in a similar point of view, because he writes at the end of his career, and I won't come back on Sallust, but of course it is not something that is very, very different from this point of view. So of course, yes, there is this influence, and but it's always a problem with the Roman history, even if in the late Republican period we are quite we have quite a lot of texts if we compare to other periods, of course.
Thank you. Can I, Anke, can I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I see your points. Obviously, just to be entirely honest, this is part of my wider research, and obviously I've taken quite different decisions on these. So, for instance, the division between the political, what is in the space of the political, and what is subsistence is something that should be. I mean, not that should be, but I personally deal with a very different idea. I think that there is a superposition which is quite extensive. On the legitimacy, what you mentioned about Cicero, and you cited a source at a certain point in which you said, I think it was a Brutus or the De Oratore, I don't remember, something about the fact that some violence was accepted, etc. I would say that is already in Livy, not already in Livy, but that is already in the shared memory of the struggle of the orders, and therefore we see the reflection in Livy. I won't take up much more. I get confused. Thank you anyway. We'll have a chance to talk about this again, I'm sure.
Okay. No, I totally agree with I have this problem with defining what I can use in the corpus. But to be honest, I didn't confront to the problem yet. But I will. But it won't take a lot of time, since Cyril Courrier already made a corpus of every place manifestation in the period. So I just have to examine it a bit closer to know precisely what to think about it. What I proposed here was more an interpretative model on the recent one. So it was mainly to have some feedbacks, in fact, on this, since yes, it's quite new. So thank you.
Some further questions or comments? Yeah, Federico.
Thanks very much, Bertrand.
Hi.
Nice to see you. I was wondering whether you see any value in a fairly recent suggestion by Erich Gruen, who says that the social war alerts a whole generation of Romans to the rewards of large-scale political violence, and alerts them to the advantages, the rewards that civil war can yield. The social war being, in Gruen's reading, a conflict that, well, maybe does not quite qualify as a civil war, but is not a straightforward external conflict. And I was wondering whether in your reading of the, I suppose, yes, patterns of political violence, and indeed the way in which they intersect with civil war, you see a shift as a result of the social war, or whether you would actually rather place the emphasis on continuity from sort of 133 down to the end of the Republic.
On violence, I think there is, of course, a shift with social war, because the exacerbated violence become more frequent, as I said a bit, but in the years 80 before Christ. So I think, of course, that social war more than every conflict before, led to a brutalization of the Roman society. I think there is a generation which was confronted to this extreme form of violence because we often underestimate the impact of this conflict of 3 years with 100,000 killed. And I think that it was then a bit minimized in the historiography and by the ancients also, because precisely they were trying to build an Italian cohesion. So I think it was quite minimized, but the very impact on this generation of what Brian called the last generation, the Roman Republic, can be underestimated. And I think that it was an explanation to the extreme forms of violence that we see in the late Roman Republic. I think here it is something very crucial because we can't explain otherwise the way, for example, for a lot of things. For example, the proscriptions, also the brutal elimination of the Samnites by Sylla. All these kind of things, we can't explain it if we don't, for example, understand that Sylla was a general during the Civil War. We can't explain neither the elimination of his enemies by Marius if we don't understand that he was also confronted to this brutal conflict. Going further, I think that we can't understand, for example, Crassus's attitude towards the slaves in the War of Spartacus, the brutal ending of these slaves, if we don't understand that Crassus also was directly impacted by this conflict, I think.
Can I quickly follow up, Anke? Very.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, on this brutalization note, which I think is very productive, do you think it is at all fair to attach some explanatory value, some explanatory importance to material concerns? And I'm referring specifically to the demographic and sort of physical expansion of the city of Rome. Issues like lack of sanitation or very precarious sanitation in the city of Rome. I'm thinking about corn supply. And I'm also thinking of an area for which we have precious little evidence, in fact, hardly any for the late Republic, which is wages. There's a brilliant comment by William Harris at the end of a paper on the Roman economy, where he says that, well, if you're looking at a huge expansion of the slave population in Italy, then it's not at all far-fetched to be thinking of a collapse in wages, in the buying power of wages. Now, there's basically no evidence for wages in the late Republic. That's a problem. But I do wonder whether a scenario may be plotted. And of course, we do have some evidence on rent control, for example, measures under Caesar. And well, you can see, can't you, in principle, you could plot, couldn't you, a scenario where, at least in the city of Rome, brutalization goes hand in hand with, deprivation or very real socioeconomic tensions. I wonder what you make of that.
I just take some notes. Yeah, I fully agree with that. In fact, I think that there is a pauperization of the, at least in Rome. And I think that, of course, it was a factor of exacerbation of violence. And I think that the fact that this traditional channel of exchange between elites and plebs was cut at the end of the Republican period, this led, of course, to an exacerbation of the violence. And I think that confronted to the blindness, in fact, of the elite, the plebs sometimes had to act in a very extreme way, I think, because of the brutalization, because of the pauperization, which is something, yeah, a very important feature of the time.
All right, further questions or comments? Well, I have a question as well. As a literary person, I think if I remember correctly that you quoted Lucan at some point or referred to Lucan, talking about this brutalization that was just discussed. And well, what do you think? To what extent can we actually use Lucan as a historiographical source there? To what extent is there a danger that he reads, well, the brutalization of his own age back into the past there? And what do you think about this, well, connection of his literary aims with his aims as a historiographer? What would you say as a proper historian to just a humble literary person there?
Of course, there's an exaggeration, maybe an exaggeration on Lucan, and above all because the Pharsalia is something which is it is written to criticize Augustus in reality. So the way he came to power in a violent way in reality, but so the violence, for example, of if we take Gratidianus, the end of Gratidianus, there may have been an exaggeration in the way that Lucan describes it. So that's why I didn't put this passage, because he describes that Catiline is cutting the tongue of Gratidianus and he's taking his eyes away and everything. So of course, it's a very sadistic way to describe the end of proscribed people. But what we see from Appian is that, of course, it was a period of crudelitas, of cruelty. And we have a lot of examples of tortures. Of course, this is a very extreme way to describe it from Lucan. And of course, he did it on purpose. But we can't exclude the fact that there was extreme violence, even if it was not precisely this one, and this type of torture. But it's for me, there is no doubt about the huge violence about that time.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Further questions or comments? If you can't make yourself, if you don't want to make yourself seen in person, which is fine, feel free to type something in the chat if you'd like. Or otherwise, feel free to raise a physical or an electronic hand. Any further questions or remarks there? Yeah, Federico, please.
Well, just out of curiosity, what you've made use of pseudo-Sallust, well, what most of us call pseudo-Sallust at some point.
Yeah.
What sort of evidentiary value do you attach to it? I mean, as you know, I don't think it's rubbish. But, many people do think it's complete.
No, it's not. It's not
either.
rubbish.
I don't think
I think it's not. I think we can use it, always precising that probably it's not Sallust, or we don't know in reality. But I think it has a value because it gives us a lot of indications about the political thought of the time. I think it's there is no doubt about this, because the way it is written, even if it's not Sallust, it gives us quite a using it, of course, with the precaution, the necessary precaution, we can use it to make to help us to make a political history of the late Republican period with a lot of cautions always, because it's a very problematic text, but we can use it anyway. I think that's why I did it. It was quite. Of course, I was expecting a question about this.
It's a predictable one.
But you know that Claudia Moratti, she uses it, and she's right. I think she's right about that.
All right, further questions or comments, expected ones or unexpected ones? Emilio.
Sorry, as long as no one jumps in, I'll just ask something else. I'd like to know what you make of the lexicological problem. So you've used seditio and dissentio. I based my research around discordia, which is the absent one in this debate. But I would like to know how you interpret seditio, especially. Because dissentio is quite unequivocal. It's something that happens in the elite.
I will take back my text just to go back to this. Wait for it. Wait for it. I'm just looking for the file. I don't know what you speak about. Okay. So, what I wanted to say about the subcategories, it was so using. Wait. So I was using the text of the De Oratore, okay, about Norbanus. And this is where there is a kind of evolution, let's say progression from dissentio to seditio. So the dissentio would be basically a kind of disagreement inside the political elite. And this is what we can deduce from the Ciceronian text. And then the seditio would be a kind of degenerative dissentio when the plebs become involved in the conflict. And this led to breaking in the civic cohesion on the fact that the plebs is mobilized contra rem publicam. So in the seditio, there is an idea, at least in Cicero, that it would be acting against the res publica, which is not necessarily the case in dissentio.
I'll just throw in a source that you think you might find useful, that I think you might find useful, and is Tacitus Historiae 143 and 2. So it's already interesting because it's not a civil setting. And you'll see that there's the whole inventory of anti-plebeian tropes, from idleness to laziness, etc. The reason why I mention it is that it seems to have a progression. There is no dissentio there, but is ad seditiones, et discordias, et ad extremum bella civilia. So from seditio to bella to civil war.
Okay.
I thought you might find it useful.
Okay, yeah, should be. So, but so for the seditio, there is it's in the book of Claudia Moatti. She shows that the theory of seditio emerged from this period, and she uses a lot of the Ciceronian texts. So I will check the reference you gave to me, because it's very interesting, since Cicero didn't speak about bellum civile in the gradation. So maybe there's one step above seditio, it would be bellum civile.
The question is, for me, whether seditio and discordia indicate the same thing or not.
Yeah,
in the
end. We are waiting for your PhD.
We'll see. Thank you.
Well, that was really subtle. Any further questions or comments? Just checking the chat if there is anything, but that is not the case right now. Anything else that people would like to raise? Right, well, that does not seem to be the case right now. So I think it is probably time to, well, wrap up then, and to thank our speaker once more very warmly for a really wonderful and inspiring paper and discussion. So let's have a, well, round of loud virtual and actual applause. You can see there's lots of actual applause. So thank you very much indeed, Bertrand.
Thank you to you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you all for coming. Have a good rest of the evening. As we said at the beginning, no paper next week, but we will have an actual in-person paper right after the Easter break, unless the world falls apart again. So let's hope that this can indeed happen. Thank you indeed. Thanks, Bertrand, and see you all again very soon then. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a nice
Bye.
evening.
Ciao Bertrand, a presto.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao Bertrand.